We came all the way from Florida to Missouri in October 2019 to ride the Katy Trail. It's an old railroad that's been turned into a trail, the longest one of its kind in the country. We started on the west end and rode east over several days back towards St. Louis. Our first day riding started with a 4-hour drive out to Clinton. The store that rented us bikes shuttled us out there. We then had our first challenge. Will everything we brought fit in the saddlebags? We didn't really have a plan B if it didn't. Are you going to fit everything in?
Yes.
It was a tight squeeze, but we made it work. By now, though, it's 12:30 and we've got to ride around 17 miles to lunch, so it's time to go. And we've got our first detour of the trip at mile 0. This turned out to be the first of many detours, but this one was just a couple of potholes, so we rode on through. We stopped in Windsor for lunch at this diner, which closed for the day while we were taking this picture. Thankfully, we found another restaurant. And then it was on to Sedalia. The trail isn't paved, it's crushed limestone, but it's smooth enough that you don't need a mountain bike. Every 10 to 20 miles or so, there's a trailhead with benches and maps. Most of them have water, and some even have bathrooms and bike tools. It's a very bike-friendly trail. Every year in the spring, the trail floods, and we learned that 2019 was the worst in about 25 years. So there were lots of closures to navigate on the later days of the trip. We made a habit of checking the condition reports on the trail's website every day because we learned that things change daily and a report from last week might not be accurate anymore. We made it to Sedalia, a big city by Katy trail standards, and our bike-friendly hotel just let us bring the bikes up to the room. We started our nightly ritual of washing clothes in the hotel and headed out into the town to grab some dinner. On day 2, we headed from Sedalia to Rocheport. We heard about a couple of detours after Boonville, but that was a week ago, so we figured we'd just see for ourselves what it was like. Turns out this was the worst detour of the trip, but I'll get to that in a minute. The Katy Trail scenery is mainly forest, cornfields, and grain silos, but there are some rivers and streams too. That day it was cloudy and the forecast called for lots of rain the next day. We were hoping the forecast would be wrong because we really didn't want to ride in the rain. This is our vacation after all. We stopped in the tiny town of Pilot Grove for lunch, and I'm still telling people about this place. I had a giant bowl of chili for something like $3. Best lunch value anywhere in America. Usually what's next to the trail is either forest or a field, but sometimes it's someone's house, and sometimes with cycling-themed Halloween decorations. When we got past Boonville, we found that the first detour had reopened, but when we got to the second, just a few miles from our destination, it was closed. The sign here says take the road to the right to get around, but that's flooded too, and at this precise moment it started to rain a little. So we turned around and had to backtrack 3 miles to get to another country road to get to Rocheport. I don't have pictures of any of that because we were already 50 miles in and running out of daylight. But we did eventually make it to our B&B in Rocheport, and the innkeeper managed to get us a table at the town's only restaurant. Day 3's destination was Jefferson City, the capital of Missouri. But when we woke up, it was raining pretty heavy, and the forecast called for rain all day over the whole area we planned to ride. Luckily, the guy we rented our bikes from was in the area, and he shuttled us and the bikes to Jefferson City. It's too bad we didn't get to ride any that day, but it would have been miserable. We did get some time to do a little wandering around in Jefferson City and see the sights. The next day we headed to Hermann, a small German town we were curious to see. It was still raining a little in the morning, but we packed up the bikes in the hotel lobby and headed out anyway. The rain eventually stopped, and we were happy to be back on the trail. A guy at the trailhead told us part of the trail was flooded, and then its detour was also flooded, and to take an alternate detour at a certain mile marker, which we did. Turns out that was flooded too. It's hard to see, but that's a small bridge under the water. It's ideal cycling conditions. Finally, the sun came out and it was a beautiful day, riding along the Missouri River. We started seeing more cornfields as we got closer to Hermann, and even some corn on the trail. In Hermann, we rented a tiny cottage apartment from a woman who was kind enough to let us park our bikes in her garage. It had a kitchen and, to our surprise, a washer and dryer. No hand washing our clothes tonight. Hermann is somewhat of a tourist destination, so despite its small size, there's plenty to see and do. We found a winery in town that we could walk to, with a restaurant where we had dinner after a long day on the bikes. On day 5, we headed from Hermann to Augusta, where we'd heard there are lots of wineries. The weather was great. The trailheads usually have information about the town you're in. This one has a picture of a building next to the trailhead from 100 years ago. And here it is today. Hasn't really changed much. Did I mention how big a deal corn is out here? This morning we started here in Hermann. We're at this trailhead right now. And we're going to have lunch at a winery which we think is right around here. Turns out the winery was easy to spot from the trail because it's way high up on a hill. We had a nice leisurely lunch and then it was on to Augusta. When we got to Augusta, we discovered that someone put a brewery basically at the trailhead. That was a nice way to unwind after the day's ride. Unfortunately, everything in Augusta closes about 6 and there are basically no restaurants, so we had to make a meal out of the snacks this winery sells and eat it on their porch after they closed. Our last day on the trail would be the shortest ride to St. Charles. Well, thought we were done with the detours. There's one more. This one's just up into City Park. Shouldn't be too bad. It was a good bit steeper and longer than it looked. Oh well, it's just part of the trail's charm. With a shorter ride this last day, we tried to really enjoy this last couple of hours riding. Eventually, we made it to St. Charles, the largest city on the trail. We were happy to turn the bikes back in and just be on foot to explore the town, which had been decorated for fall. Our hotel was on the main street, and it looked just like any other store, except with no one inside. They had given us a key to the street side door, and their common room is inside, which we had all to ourselves that night. All in all, we rode over 200 miles across most of Missouri. The riding is pretty flat and easy, but you can do some distance to make some big days if you want. Definitely check the trail conditions every day online and talk to the other riders you find in town and at the trailheads to get the latest information. The Katy Trail is a great rail trail, and we wish there were more trails this long and well maintained that we could ride. But for now, it's back to Florida until our next vacation.